In this episode, I'll be showing how you can make a little shuttle, like the one that you can see here. Hello again. So, I've been trying my hand at some solo sci-fi gaming recently, and, not surprisingly, that's put me in the mood to make some more sci-fi stuff, including the shuttle that you just saw. And, to make one of these, as usual, you'll need to download the PDF file. It's a pay-what-you-want product over on DriveThruRPG, so it's essentially free if you put a 0 in the little box. And you'll need to print out one of each page. You'll also need some card and cardboard of varying thicknesses. A bit of foam core is also nice to have, plus we'll be using some empty toilet roll tubes and a few drinking straws. So, now that's all out of the way, let's get started. Okay then, the first thing we're going to do is take this page here, and from that we'll cut out all 4 of the kind of squashed hexagon shapes, which we'll then glue to some corrugated card or similar. And that's what you can see me doing here, just using a regular glue stick. We'll then give that a few minutes to dry, so here's one that I made earlier, and that can be cut to size with a sharp knife and a metal ruler. Once again, like you can see me doing here. So, there you go. And we'll need to do the same thing for the other 3 pieces as well. Right then, next we'll take the large rectangular piece and glue that to some thin cereal box card. But before we cut it out, we'll also need to score it along these 4 lines, so that when we do cut it out, it should be easier to bend into this kind of shape. Though I should also point out that, on the reverse side, we'll also need to mark out a couple of lines, roughly 1 3/4 inches in from either end, as you can hopefully see. Anyway, if we then bring the other pieces back in, we can then glue the 2 textured end pieces into place. And when doing this, I like to do it in stages, so I'll glue the top into place first, and do each of the sides separately. So I'll leave the video running while I do just that. And there you go. And now that that's done, it's then just a matter of gluing the 2 internal pieces into place, using the lines that we marked out earlier as a guide for where they need to be. Though, as you just saw, I do need to add that when doing this, you'll need to make sure that the printed sides are facing outward, facing towards the 2 end pieces that were just glued into place. And when that's done, we should end up with this kind of thing. So, the hull or the fuselage for our little shuttle. Okay, for the cockpit, we'll be using these textures that you can see here. And the first thing we'll need to do is glue these 2 pieces to some corrugated card or foam core, it's not really all that important which, and then cut those to size. We'll then stick these 2 textures to some cereal box card, and like before, we'll also score them along these lines that you can see here, so that we can cut them out and bend the top piece into this kind of shape. And as you'll see in a second, the bottom piece, that can be bent into this shape. It's fairly straightforward stuff. Next, we'll take the glue gun again, and I like to first apply some hot glue to one side of the top piece, then stick that to the exposed corrugated edge of one of the side pieces, like you can hopefully see me doing. And after that's set, the same can be done on the other side, doing our best to get nice sharp corners. So, this kind of thing. We can then repeat the process with the bottom half, though this time you'll see that I'm doing it in several stages again, as I just find it easier to get everything nicely aligned when doing it this way. So yeah, I'll continue with that. And with any luck, that should result in something like this. Okay, next we're going to glue the side windows to some thick cardboard or thin corrugated card, because we don't really want this to be too thick, as we will need to cut the curved side out with a pair of scissors. Then the main window itself, that can be glued to part of an empty toilet roll tube, to take advantage of its natural curve. And that also needs to be cut to size. Though, just to be clear, when we glue the window together, we will need to make sure that it's positioned in such a way that these little wedge shapes, they line up with each other. Hopefully you can see what I mean there. Anyway, it's then just a simple matter of sticking them together in a similar way to the piece that you just saw, and just making it as clean an assembly as possible. So, nice crisp corners, and making sure nothing overhangs any of the sides. Basically, we're aiming for something that looks like this. And if you hadn't already guessed, that's then going to be glued on top of the first piece, like with this quick test fit that I'm doing. However, do be careful to not use too much glue for this part. For example, here, I'm trying to keep most of the glue away from the outside edges of the corrugated card, just so that it doesn't seep out and make a mess of everything. But yeah, when we're done, it should end up looking something like that. And all we'll need to do then is stick that to one end of the fuselage. So that's what I'm going to do. And when doing this, you'll need to make sure that you're gluing it to the end with that weird T-shape on the front. And if you look carefully, you'll also notice some weld lines running from the top of the texture to the bottom. And those mark where it lines up with the sides of the cockpit, so make sure to keep the hot glue inside of those. Then, if it all goes to plan, that should result in this kind of thing. So yeah, this is what we're aiming for. Now, for the hatch at the rear, we'll be using these textures. And it's going to be the same process again. So we'll glue the side panels to some more corrugated card, leave them to dry, and then cut them to size. The hatch itself is glued to more cereal box card, then scored along the line shown here on the screen, so that we can cut it out and bend it into this kind of shape. And after that, it's then just a matter of gluing the side panels into place, like you've seen me do previously. Then, at the end of all that, we should be left with something like this. Essentially, it's just a much simpler version of what we did for the cockpit. And, just like the cockpit, that also needs to be glued to the end of the fuselage. So, I'll go ahead and quickly do that as well. So, there you have it. You can now see that we have a hatch at the back, and the cockpit at the front. Though I do want to pause briefly for a second and say that this shape here, this might end up being the basic hull, fuselage, chassis, whatever you want to call it. It might end up being a kind of basic building block for other projects in the future. So in this video it's being used to make a small shuttle, but I might make other PDFs further down the line where the wings can be replaced with maybe wheels or tracks, for example, to turn it into an APC or something like that. And if that ends up being the case, then I might refer viewers back to the first 8 minutes or so of this video, as this will serve as a kind of, a starting point for each of those projects. So, if you are watching in the future, and I've referred you back to this video to make the chassis for a 6-wheeled armoured truck, for example, then this is the point where you can go back to the truck video and continue watching that. But yeah, let me know if that's something you'd like to see. Anyway, back to this project. Now, for this next part, we'll be using these pieces, and we'll glue the smaller ones to some corrugated card or foam core, which we'll then cut to size. As for the long rectangular shape, that needs to be glued to thin card again, scored along the guidelines, cut to size, and then folded into this kind of shape. As you can tell, it's a bit of a repetitive process. Speaking of which, we'll also mark a few lines on the underside, but this time they need to be roughly 1.5 inches in from either end. Then, it's just a matter of gluing all of these pieces together in much the same way as we did with the main fuselage. It's pretty much the same thing, just on a smaller scale. So, here's how it looks when it's done. This is the kind of thing that we're aiming for. Okay, Next, we're going to glue the tail fin graphic to some foam core, mine is around 5mm thick, and cut that to size, like so. We'll then cut out the piece for the other side and simply glue that to the opposite side of the foam core, so that we end up with a piece that's textured on both sides. Basically, this kind of thing. However, we will need to cover these exposed edges here, and for that I've included a couple of different textures in the PDF. So, a grey one and a green one. And in this instance, I've gone with the grey one. So I've cut out a piece that's 5mm wide to match the thickness of the foam core that I'm using, and it's a little bit longer than those three edges that I just highlighted. Then we can simply apply some glue to the back and wrap that around those three edges to hide the remaining foam core. So there you go, that's that done. Though I also like to run the end of a paintbrush along the edge that's going to be attached to the ship, just to create a little valley almost for the hot glue to run into. Anyway, here's what we've got done so far, and all we'll need to do is glue the long thin piece over the top of the white area that you can see here, and like before, there's also a kind of weld line that can be used to help line up the edges. Plus, you'll also need to make sure that the little pill-shaped indentations, they are positioned towards the front. Then it's a simple matter of gluing the tail fin on top of that, in the middle of that kind of blank grey area towards the back. That should then leave us with something like this. And yeah, these extra pieces, they just help to break up the kind of boxy shape. But yeah, the last things on this page are these shapes here. And as you've probably guessed, we'll be gluing those to something. In this case, some thick card. I think this stuff is around 1mm thick. And then cutting them to size. Then, to glue them into place, I actually prefer some PVA glue for this part. So here I am applying a reasonable amount to the back, trying to leave a slight gap around all of the edges so that it doesn't seep out, and then sticking it to the side of the hull. Next, we'll just need to repeat that process for the other piece on the other side. And the reason we're adding these, that will become more apparent later on when we attach the turbines or the thrusters, whatever you want to call them. For now though, we just need to make sure that they're glued into place. So, this kind of thing. That's all we'll need to do at this stage. Okay, now for the wings, which is this page here. And these are made in a similar way to the tail fin. So we'll glue the top side to some more of the same 5mm thick foam core. And when it's dry, we'll cut it to size. We'll then cut out the bottom texture and glue that to the bottom of the wing with the trusty glue stick, so that we eventually end up with something like this. Then we'll cut a couple more pieces of the edge texture, this time I've gone with the green version, and we'll use those to cover the two angled sides of the wing, as ideally we want to leave the two parallel sides as they are, because we're going to be gluing things to those, and we'll get a much better bond if we apply the glue to the foam core itself, and not a bit of paper that's been stuck to the side. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, when we've done that, here's how it should look. Anyway, next we'll stick these textures to some more thick card, and guess what? We're going to cut those out as well, so that we can then glue those into place. And yeah, I know, my videos, they do get a bit repetitive after a while, but it is what it is, I suppose. That being said, I will point out that when doing this part, we want to make sure that we're lining up these pieces with the texture on the wing, and not the edges of the wing, as they're actually designed to overhang ever so slightly. So yeah, try to keep that in mind when you're doing this part. Anyway, here I am lining up the smaller of the two pieces, and when that's done, here's how the wings are currently looking. Then, just like I did with the tail fin, I also like to add a little groove to the two exposed edges of the foam core. Again, just to give the hot glue somewhere to flow into. However, we're not quite done yet, so for this next part, we'll need to cut out one of these textures, which we're going to use to texture a drinking straw, just by applying some glue to the back and then wrapping it around the straw. So there you go, simple as that. Then, when it's dry, we can squash it flat, trim it to size with a sharp pair of scissors, and if you're using a paper straw, you might need to open the ends back out again, and I just use a pencil for this. When that's done, we'll then glue the small plain texture to some cereal box card, and if we take a hole punch, we can punch out a couple of small circles, like so. These can then be hot glued to each end of the straw to cover up the holes and make it look like one solid piece. Basically, we want it to end up looking something like this. And we can then hot glue that to the wing in the orientation that I'm showing here. And while I'm doing that, maybe you could consider hitting the like button, assuming you actually like how this one is shaping up. But yeah, there's the finished wing. Though we will of course need to make 2 of these, and the only thing you need to be mindful of is making sure that when you glue the straw into place on the second one, it needs to be a mirror image of the first one. Other than that, it's the exact same thing. Right then, the textures for the engines, or turbines, thrusters, whatever you want to call them, they're spread over 2 pages, but each page contains all the parts to make one of them. So for these, we'll take an empty toilet roll tube, cut it down the middle, and then cut it to these dimensions shown here on the screen. Plus, you'll also notice that I've drawn a guideline 3¼ inches away from one of the sides, and this is because we're going to apply some glue to the smaller side of that line, and also on the inside of the opposite edge, if you like, so that we can then roll it back into a tube, using that line as a guide for how much of the card overlaps. And if we hold that together while it dries, we should end up with a similar but smaller tube. We'll then need to cut out the main engine texture, apply some glue to the back of that, and then start wrapping it around the tube, like I'm doing here. With the idea being that it's a quick and easy way to make the main part of the engine, as you can hopefully see. Anyway, next we'll glue the blank circles to cardboard of some description, and then cut those to size with a pair of scissors. We'll also cut out the 2 larger circles as well, the ones with the end graphics, but for now I'm just going to concentrate on these ones here. So if we then apply some glue to the back of the textured circle, we can stick the smaller cardboard circle in the middle of that, and then make lots of little cuts all the way around the circumference, with a sharp pair of scissors. At this point I also like to add a bit more glue to the overhanging paper, just so that when we place the cardboard circle inside the one end of the tube, we can fold all of these little paper tabs over to secure this end piece into place. Which should result in this kind of thing. Though if I pause the video here for a second, you'll see that for this particular end piece, I did try to make sure that the ends of the kind of asterisk shape, they lined up with the panel lines of the engine. But yeah, next we're going to stick the plain pattern to the inside of another toilet roll tube, and from this we're going to cut out a strip that's 5/8 of an inch wide. Then what we're going to do with this is to try and cut it out so that it's just long enough to wrap around the end that we just covered. And I prefer to err on the side of caution and cut it a bit bigger to begin with, then just kind of trim away a bit at a time until I get a good fit. Then, once we're happy with that, we'll need to apply some glue to the darker end of the engine piece itself, like you can see here. You can also add some to half of the other piece as well if you like, and then glue those 2 pieces together, using the panel line at the end of the engine as a guide for how much of the 2 pieces should overlap. And that should result in this kind of thing. Next we'll cut out this texture, then apply some glue to the back, and wrap that around the outside in the orientation that you can see me doing here. So that when it's done, the back end of the engine looks like this. Then we can do the exact same thing for the other end, but this time using the other set of textures. And when we've done that, we should now have an engine turbine thing that looks like this at the back, whereas the front end, the intake end, that looks like this. And we will of course need to make 2 of these, one for each side. Anyway, if I now bring the wings back in, we can then glue those to the engines. But before I do that, I'll just quickly show that I'm actually going to be positioning mine so that the top of the wing lines up with this line here. Kind of like I'm doing with this quick test fit. And I am going to make sure that the straws at the end of the wings, they're pointing towards the front of the engines as well. So there's the first one done, and here I am doing the second one. As I say, just make sure that they're both a mirror image of each other. If you do that, you should then end up with 2 wing assemblies that look like this. Now, you remember those side panels that we glued to the fuselage earlier on? Well, they should now fit in between the two end pieces of the thrusters, with just a little bit of clearance, as you can hopefully see. So, all we'll need to do is apply a generous line of hot glue along the line on the panel itself, and then stick the wing assembly to that, so that the grille along the top of the engine, that's facing upwards. And we'll also need to make sure that it's glued on reasonably straight. Then we can do the exact same thing on the other side, and obviously, do make sure that you have the intake at the front and the exhaust at the back. And with that, that's the main part of the assembly done. So you could leave it like that if you like, but if you also want to add some landing gear, then I'll cover that next. Okay, I'll try to run through this fairly quickly as this video is starting to drag on a bit, but we'll be using these textures here, and they should be the only ones left at this stage. So we'll first glue this one to some thick card, and then cut those out. We can then take this one, which we'll need to cut into roughly 3 equal parts, so that we can glue one of those around a small cocktail style straw, and simply cut that to size. We'll then do a similar thing with this texture, so cut it into 3, wrap those around a regular size straw, and then cut them to size. Though for this last piece we are going to need to cut the bottom at a slight angle. So to do this, we'll just need to fold it in half, then start our cut on the dark line that you can see running around the bottom of the straw, and angle the cut towards the end of the straw itself. So I'm hoping you can see what I did there. Then it's a simple matter of applying a tiny spot of glue to the bottom of the smaller straw, sticking that in the centre of the small circle, then doing the same thing again with the angled edge of the larger straw, and also adding a bit more glue near to the top of the first one, then sticking that on top of the large circle so that it leans back and touches the smaller straw. I don't think I explained that very well, but you can see the kind of thing that I mean here. Or, well, at least I hope you can. Anyway, next we'll take this texture and glue it to some more thick card, but this time we'll just cut out the outside rectangle. Then we'll trim this texture to size and glue that to the back, which I've already done off camera just to speed things up a bit. We'll then need to score along the line shown here, so that when we cut these pieces out, not only do we end up with something that's textured on both sides, but they can also be bent into this kind of shape. After that, all that's left to do is to apply some PVA glue to the underside of the first piece, and glue that to the middle of the double-sided piece, so that the larger straw is at the same end as the larger fold, if that makes sense. Essentially, we're looking to end up with a little assembly that looks something like this that you can see here. And we'll actually need to make 3 of those. Okay then, so here's the shuttle, and here's one of the little feet, and this is going to be a bit hard to see, but what we're going to try and do is glue the smaller upright straw on top of that little T-shape inside the cockpit. As I say, it's hard to see, but you can just about see what I'm trying to explain at this point here. So yeah, let's do just that, just by applying plenty of hot glue inside the guidelines, and making sure that the bottom of the foot is level with the ground. And hopefully that should result in the kind of thing that you can see here. Then, not surprisingly, all we'll need to do is the same thing all over again for the 2 feet at the back of the shuttle. Though I will say that it is becoming painfully obvious that I need a bigger area to film in when doing large projects like this, so just so you know, it is something that I'm hoping to fix. Anyway, here's the last foot going on now. Then here's a quick look at how the whole thing looks from the underneath. Then, if I spin that over, here's the finished shuttle. And despite being quite small, the landing gear, it's actually quite sturdy. It doesn't really wobble much at all. But yeah, I know this has been a long one, but I think it was worth it in the end. So I'll finish things off with a picture of this one in action, so to speak, and as I said earlier, I'd be interested to know if anyone would like me to make variations of this one, using the same chassis but with wheels instead of wings, for example. Plus, it would also just be good to get your thoughts on this episode in general. And with that, I'll just say thank you very much for watching, as always, and I'll look forward to seeing what you think of this one down in the comments. So, thanks again, and bye for now.